Thank you. Especially thank you getting up early to come to class. I tend not to schedule any of my courses this early because the students really don't want to get up, so I appreciate you doing it. So I'm going to talk today about balancing design technology to tackle global grand challenges, and this is work that's come out of about 10 years of work where I felt as a computer scientist that many of the things people do are really a little too related to what the next big thing going on in industry in Silicon Valley, and that in academia we maybe should be focusing on longer term challenges, trying to push out further and seeing where we could have impact on the world. So you're going to see a few projects that have been going on for several years, some for only a few years, with a lot of different people at several institutions. Some of this work actually came out of some time I spent with my family living in China. I spent a 2.5-year sabbatical there, and it was a very interesting time. I came back from that trip 5 years ago, but that time in China was very interesting because there's a lot of excitement there, even with the maybe slight cooling of the economy this year. The people have a real sense of something changing in terms of where China's place is in the world. But this excitement about the economy and the politics is really seen differently in China. It's really seen as just a return to a traditional place of the society over, the 5,000 years of Chinese culture. And I found interesting this time in terms of learning the culture and the business and the research in China was important in many aspects of my life. One I found very interesting was to see how business executives and professors actually use these historical stories from the culture of China in everyday business discussions. So I'm going to actually start my talk with one such story. So this horse here is a solid bronze statue that's over 2,000 years old. It's from the Han Dynasty. It is one of the important cultural relics in China. It's actually the symbol of tourism China. But this solid bronze horse was only uncovered in 1969. And it represents a story about the horses in the west of China, that the legend was that they were so fast that they literally flew. So this is called in English the heavenly steed. And if you look at it, you'll notice that these three hooves are in the air, and this fourth one is on this object that's hard to make out in here, but this is actually a swallow that's flying and looking up almost in horror as it's being crushed by this flying horse. And the legend was interesting, but also the experts who studied this were baffled at first as to how this really unsymmetrical solid bronze stood and what was the technology to build this 2,000 years ago and not have it just fall over. And they studied for a while to understand this. Now, even today, you would think with our technology it should be really easy to make this, but I've tried to buy replicas of this on Taobao, which is like the eBay in China, or in markets in Beijing, and they all do different little hacks to make this easier. They put a hole in the middle and so you can glue different weights to get it right. Or most of them, what you'll find is this bird gets really big relative to what you would think the scale should be. But I think at a larger level, this statue to me represents this concept of balance. This balance between the beautiful artistry required to design it, but also the science and engineering to somehow calculate the center of mass, which is how we think it may have been done, or they just made 300 of them until they got one right. But I like to think the former. And this balance between art and technology, or design and technology, I think is important even today as we want to design projects and products that people are going to desire and want and affect their lives. So in my research at Stanford, as well as in my teaching, we try to bring this balance. So although I'm in the computer science department, I'm probably the person who brings design most into what we do. So both in the research and teaching, we try to give students exposure to both of these. My time in China also led me to believe that it's important to find a balance between different cultures. We actually found very interesting results in projects we did where cultural attitudes really made an effect on how well user interfaces were designed. And I'll show you some feedback interfaces for behavior change in this talk, and we've found interesting results there that very much differ between Eastern and Western culture, and that's still an area that I'm working on here at Stanford. So what I want to share with you is 3 areas that I think are very important areas for doing research that I think also represent an issue of balance, and show you results that we've done over the years as well as things that we're working on now. So the first one is really in the realm of health. So this is a map of the United States showing body mass index being greater than 30. 30 is the point where we consider people clinically obese, and that's the point where we start to see a lot of correlation with health problems, particularly diabetes, heart disease, but other things have been shown. And you can see here in 1990, this data from the Center for Disease Control. Most of the US states are either this dark green, meaning less than 10% of the population of that state had a BMI 30 or higher, or a lighter green, 10 to 15%. And the ones that are gray, they just didn't have data in that year. So as I roll this forward from 1990, I think you'll know what will happen here, but I think it's dramatic to see it in this way. As we roll through the 90s, we start to see the map yellow. The South is leading here. Mississippi's got to be number 1. And as we move forward, the map gets orange. And if we get to the year 2010, which is the last year that the CDC allows me to use this map because they changed their source of data the next year, and it will show you the same things, but you're not supposed to compare. But what you see here is by 2010, in this 20-year period, we went from most states being under 10% or 10 to 15% to we have about over a third of the states are above this line of 30%, and a third or 25 to 30%, and slightly less or 20 to 25. If you do this by population, it's essentially a third of the United States adult population is clinically obese. Okay? This is really an epidemic in terms of a disease. It's a real problem. And you might say, oh, is that just the aging of the baby boomers? Is that what we're seeing? In fact, it's not. If you look at childhood obesity rates, they follow the same curve. In the last few years, I think a year or two ago, there was a big story in the New York Times that they think maybe the kids have had plateaued for like 5-year-olds or something like this. And then there was a story in the last year that they think maybe the adults have finally plateaued. But even if we've plateaued, we're kind of at an issue here. Now, this is in some ways a balance between, at the fundamental level, we could say the amount we eat and the exercise we do. Any solutions to this or why this happens, not everyone agrees, and it's probably several different things, right? We have in the United States, the supersizing craze of the restaurants, so large portions. We have subsidies of corn and the amount of corn sugar that's in a lot of products. We have people spending more time in their cars and commuting and using internet or TV or games and less time out doing things with their family. It's probably a variety of these. So I've had an interest in, what might we do there. Now, what was surprising is when I lived in China, a country that we see as a developing country, we saw very similar trends were occurring. This statistic said more than 7% of Chinese children are obese, second only to the US. Now, I don't know if the China National Task Force on Obesity, childhood obesity, is a source to be trusted as much as CDC, but it's clear that you could see, especially with middle-class boys, some trends occurring here. This was from the People's Daily. This was showing a weight loss camp with a military theme near Shanghai. And you saw all these boys are, being put through, weightlifting and all this other stuff to work on this. So before coming to Stanford, I was a professor, actually everywhere, but I was a professor at the University of Washington for 10 years. And as part of that time, I ran a research lab in Seattle for Intel. And in the mid-2000s, we ran a research project that I think is a precursor to many of the activity tracking products that you see today. So this was called UbiFit. And what we did is we built a sensor system that someone could wear on their belt, so it was about the size of a pager. And in that system, we had essentially a computer with 10 different sensors that could tell with about 95% accuracy if somebody was riding a bike, whether they were walking, whether they were running, if they were on a stair machine or an elliptical trainer. And it would send that data over Bluetooth to, at the time, in 2006, that was about the best smartphone you could buy. And 1 year later, it was eclipsed by the iPhone and thrown out for junk. But the basic idea of this system was, how could you give people feedback about their physical activity in a way that would help them be better aware of how they were doing with respect to their exercise goals so that they could improve? And some of the lessons from this system I don't think we've gotten yet today with the Fitbits and Nike trackers or even Apple Watch. And in fact, a really key observation that Sunny Consalvo, who did her PhD on this work and is now at Google, was that people were taking out their phones literally hundreds of times per day. And studies have shown this now, that people take out their phone anywhere between 100 and 200 times per day. And she wanted to take advantage of all those glances at the screen when you were taking it out to change your behavior. So in this case, we took over that background screen there on this Windows Mobile 5 phone, and it grew this garden based on how much exercise you had gotten. So every time you went for 30 minutes of aerobic activity, a run or a bike, it would grow one of these pink flowers. And if you walked 10 minutes or more, one of these sunflowers would grow. And if you did strength training or stretching, one of the blue or white flowers would grow. And so it could automatically infer those physical activities, like the aerobic ones or walking. Any of the strength training or stretching, you would have to journal yourself. And in any of these systems, you really have to have journaling, because the AI, the machine learning, it will mess up every now and then, or people need a chance to edit it. And if you met your goal for the week, this butterfly would appear. Okay? So that's what the system looked like. And the idea was not that you looked at this display and started counting, going, oh, I did 3 runs and this or that. The idea was, during all those glances, when you're pulling out the phone to see the time or to check an SMS or play Angry Birds or whatever it was, you would notice if it was late in the week and your garden was a little empty, you might think, okay, I'm going to bring my gym bag to work today and I'm going to go to the gym instead of go to lunch with my pals. Or if it was later in the week and it looked like this, you would feel good that you were doing the behaviors that helped you meet your goals that you had set. So we studied this. I, as the manager of the lab, spent a lot of money on building those hardware devices and doing the machine learning, which is really some fundamental research. We published some of the first papers in those areas. But I thought that automatic journaling, the automatic activity inference, as we'd call it, was really the key feature to this. We did a 3-month field trial after doing shorter studies to work out a lot of the bugs, in this case with 28 people. And there were really 3 conditions to this study. And in one condition, people had the full system. So they wore that thing on their waist and they had the background screen on their phone. In another group of people, they had the background screen, but they didn't have the automatic activity inference. They had to manually journal things themselves. And then in the third case, they had the automatic activity inference, but they didn't have the flower garden. If they wanted to see how they were doing, they had to run the app and see their data there, just kind of how most apps work today. If you want to see it, you go to the app. So those were the conditions. Now, we had to run this study. At this time, the way those Intel labs worked was they took a professor from the university, so from UW, and they ran the lab for 3 years. And then you would rotate to another professor and go back on the faculty. So by this time, the next guy actually was in charge, and he really wanted his resources, which was the people, to work on something else. He said, you guys got to get that study done so I can use them for something else. And we were like, wait, it's October. This is not a great time to do a study. But in the end, it was a good time to do a study. So we ran the fitness study starting in November, near Thanksgiving for the study. It went through December and in January. Now, unlike Palo Alto, one of the main reasons I returned to the Bay Area, it's not nice at that time of year in Seattle. In fact, it's not nice for 9 months. But it gets cold, it gets dark, it gets wet. And a lot of research already shows that people drop off on their exercise during that time of year in that kind of climate. due to the weather as well as the holidays disrupt people's eating and exercise schedules. So originally we thought that was a bad thing. In the end, this was actually a good thing for doing the research because we found that the people who had the garden, this ambient display that reminded them about their fitness activities and what they had done, they were actually able to maintain their activities through the 3 months. Whereas the people who had to think about what it was and run the app to go, hey, how am I doing? Those people dropped off like the prior research showed, okay? So I like to think of the devices we have today, many of them, I need to think, oh, how many steps have I hit? And I hit a button to see it. It's not something that I stay conscious of throughout the day. The Apple Watches tried this with a very little circular thing that you're supposed to notice, and it's so small you'll never notice it. So they didn't get it right in their first one. The newest one, they have a sports one that maybe does it better, but they're not quite there yet. So in my summary of this work, I would say the ambient display is the key feature. So having that on the background screen and letting people see it over and over is really important. That's not to say that you don't want that automatic tracking. In fact, we asked any of the people in this study, and they would say, oh yeah, I would want it to be automatically tracked. Another issue is this study is only 3 months, which in computer science in this field, that was a pretty long study trying to keep a research level system running. I mean, that was all our own built hardware, research quality software was kind of hard. But in a longer term situation, people probably will stop wanting to journal manually. That question hasn't really been answered yet, but I think it's important. So that's one area where we've looked for how do we help people with balance. And we're still working on some of these ideas, and I'll show you some later here at Stanford. Another area that we've worked on is balance between humans and the environment. So here you see Lake Mead at a fairly low level. We've had a little more rain in the West over the last couple of years, but if you've read, you know that the droughts are not really over. We've maybe at best just kind of relieved the worst pressure. But this is not just a problem here in the Western United States. 36 US states were expected to face serious water shortages in a 5-year period, and that was back in 2013. Here in California, you know, we can see a population that's grown to almost 40 million people in places that look like that, you know, nice, lush, green. But that's in the middle of this, right? In the middle of the desert. This is in Rancho Mirage near Palm Springs, okay? And if you read a lot during the water crisis that, you know, people out here in the desert have daily per capita water use more than double the state average. And this was totally continuing in the drought. It was very hard to get people to stop keeping their golf courses green there and things like this. If you look though at the map, this was in the New York Times in April 2015, you can see how much drought there is across the US. So there's drought in all kinds of places. You know, some people don't know Atlanta, Georgia really suffers with water problems. There's drought in many places. And even with the increased rains in last year, if you look at this updated map here from NOAA, you can see it's almost the same regions. The main difference is kind of in the northern Texas, Oklahoma is less severe than it was there, but you'll still see a lot of drought. Again, when I was living in China, so I was there with my family 2010 to 2012, I was surprised to find that in the winter, they were melting snow to get water in Beijing. So Beijing is really next to the desert there. Northern China is historically very dry. And in fact, a lot of the population lives up in the north where it's dry, all the water's in the south. One of the largest construction projects in the history of the planet is not the Three Gorges Dam, which is huge. And if you ever get a chance to go in China, go on a cruise and see it. It's amazing how big it is. But is actually a water project that's moving water from the south of China to the north. It's led to a lot of environmental degradation, movement of villages, et cetera, more than the Three Gorges Dam. It's almost considered a 100-year engineering project because it was first proposed by Mao in the early 1950s. And I think the first water just got to Beijing a couple of years ago, but it's a continuing project for a long time. So one question we had is, you know, at least from the consumer point of view, how could we help people reduce their water usage? okay? Now again, just like the food and the exercise, there's many different problems going on, and the solutions involve policy as well as consumer use as well as efficiency. In this case, one question we had is, where could we help people who wanted to save water save water? Now I know this is called classes without quizzes, so originally I was going to have a quiz. I thought I'd be mean and have a pop quiz, but does anyone know where in the home the largest use of water is? Outside, toilets, where else? Showers. Okay, you guys are good. See, Stanford kids, I got to be careful. You might get all the answers. If you do surveys of this, people will get the answers wrong. So either they'll forget about outside, which is the biggest if you have it. And then if you look in the home, generally people get at least one of the top three of those wrong. The number one being toilets. Most people will not get that. And then after that, we have washing machines and showers and baths. Okay, so people have a hard time knowing exactly where their water use is because you don't see meters on each of your devices. You have to know that. You have to have the knowledge. So one of the projects that we did at the University of Washington was to see if we could make a much easier way to sense water usage in the home. Until this point, you would essentially have to put a sensor on each device to tell this. My colleague Shwetak Patel, who's a MacArthur Genius Award winner at UW, had the insight that you could think of the water pipes as almost an information network. And if you could put a sensor at one location, every time someone opens or closes a valve, there's a pressure wave that goes through. And if you could sense that wave, the wave will look different depending on what type of water usage you had and where it was in the home. So you could have the same, Kohler faucet in the kids' bathroom and in your bathroom, but because they're somewhere different in the pipe network, that signal will look different. And using simple signal processing, so machine learning, we showed that we could get over 95% accuracy on this with one sensor. So you could install it in one place. So he and one of my graduate students, John Freilich, spun this off into a startup. It was sold to Belkin, and they made this device called Wemo, which I haven't seen in the market yet. I know they were testing it with utilities, but essentially you could just hook this in below one of your sinks in the kitchen or a bathroom and plug it in, and that one sensor could tell the water use in your home and send it via a wireless network to a computer. Now, my main interest in this was less in the sensing and machine learning and more in, okay, if I have that data, what am I going to do with it? How do I use that to help people with their behavior? One thing that I like to lambast in my undergraduate classes is the smart fridge. So every year at the Consumer Electronics Show, some manufacturer likes to put out these smart fridges that's going to tell you when you need to buy milk. And I'm always like, that's not a big problem. You say, hey, we're out of milk. Can somebody get the milk? They seem to think people want to pay $5,000 to know that. So I thought, oh, hey, here's a good use for that smart fridge. We could use the display that they put on these things as an ambient display for home water use or home energy use, because that's a well-trafficked place in the home, or you could hang it on the wall if you wanted, but I thought I'd use the smart fridge. So John Freilich, who was the graduate student working with me, who's now a professor at Maryland, decided to design what should the display look like. So he literally made over 100 different displays of water use and tested them with hundreds of people online to understand, could people interpret these to understand where the water usage was, but also get at some of the different cultural issues around displaying water use. So we were surprised to find that different family values would lead people to want this information in different ways. For example, we had a display that might let you be able to tell that Johnny's using all the water up in the upstairs bathroom. Okay, some families said, I don't want Johnny to be singled out. That's a family thing. We are gonna, work on that together. On the other hand, if one of my two boys was using all the water, I wanna know. But that's something that you might need to design for, that people are gonna want that information in different ways. I'm gonna show you a few of these displays just to give you a flavor of this. So this one was kind of an aquatic ecosystem, and as you used it, you had your fish Frank here, and you had some water-saving goal with a tracker on the left. And this is obviously sped up in time. But if you met your goal, let's say for the week or month, then Frank met his mate, and so you had another fish in your tank. And if you kept meeting your goal, you have some guppies, and so on, and eventually you'll get your water wheel and all these other things that you might have in there. John also made this touch sensitive, so if you touched one of the fish, they would kind of swim away. Again, families that had children really liked that one. This one here was called Rainflow, which I think is a more useful design in some ways, especially given that issue of people not understanding where or what activity their water use was for. So in this case, imagine this on that fridge or in another high traffic place in the home. It had news headlines, it had the weather, it had some average use over time, and then it had the date and time. The idea is you would glance at it to see those things, and then again, like UbiFit, you might notice this thing about the water. And then here you have these different uses of water going across the display. So this is again sped up over time. You might have some water saving goal. You'll know, monthly we use this and we're trying to reduce here. And what would happen is if you went over the amount for that device, you'll see what happens. Well, again, John's showing, hey, I can make it touch sensitive and beautiful. But you would see that if the water went over your goal, then it would kind of like go over, okay? So at the end of this, John got his PhD and went off to become a professor, and I really felt we hadn't done the one last thing, is we have not studied this where we did a long-term deployment in homes with a baseline that we could compare to. That's really what has to occur. Because maybe this would work, maybe not. Maybe my sons would be flushing the toilet to see that cool display going over. Yeah, so, I mean, you really have to test in situ to find out, and that this work, now that those Wemo devices are coming out, will make it a lot easier to do that kind of deployment. Again, the hardware that we were using to do this was very, very tricky to do a large deployment, but now with commercial hardware, it'll be a lot easier. Another area that we worked on was using the same type of phones in the late 2000s. We worked on something called the UB Green Transportation Display. And in this case, we were trying to encourage people to be greener in their daily commute pattern. So in this case, as you took green transportation, walked, biked, took the bus, or carpooled, this tree would grow leaves over the day for each one of those incidents that you did, and then those pink flowers. And it would also show you, what the last thing you did. So this meant someone had carpooled. But what was interesting is when we started this work, we found that although 80% of people said, I would like to be greener in my transportation habits, we then did a study where every time someone took a trip, which we could sense on your phone even before there was GPS, we had a way of doing this, we'd pop up a little survey and say, hey, it looks like you took a trip. Which modality did you take? And then what were the reasons? And you'll find that although 80% say, yes, I'd like to be more green, being sustainable might be 6th or 7th on the reason for the current modality. Things that were correlated with being green, but were more important, were things like saving money, stress, getting exercise, or being able to do something else while commuting. So we tried to show those. So for example, if you carpooled, you maybe save money. If you took the bus, depending who's on your bus, it might be calmer. It all depends. Some people commuting on the bus or train is hard, but I remember my wife used to commute Berkeley to San Francisco. She loved that bus. I mean, imagine driving that bridge every day. It's not fun. Or could I get other work done? And then in this case, when you met your goal, these fruit would appear on the tree. So that's how this one worked. I did this with colleagues at Carnegie Mellon, and they had a theory that people would bond with animals. So we actually had a different version of this with this polar ecosystem. Started with one polar bear on a little piece of ice, and then the greener you were, the ecosystem became nicer. Now, I actually designed that and had a graphic designer draw it. And my idea of these was, it's just like UbiFit. It's just a display so that at a glance, you kind of know, how am I doing for the week? It wasn't meant to be anything more than almost a visual bar graph. So what was interesting is we ran a pilot study of this. I thought that ambient display was really just to give you this information so you knew what was going on. The pilot study was 4 weeks with 12 people, half in Pittsburgh and half in Seattle. We had slight differences in those populations. The people in Seattle were a lot greener. The people in Pittsburgh, we had people, driving the car a mile to go to their friend's house. So what were the results? One, people wanted to keep using it. That's interesting, especially because this study was run in about 2008. Still using those phones. By that point, the iPhone had been out a year or two, and if you just to want to keep running on this phone that now felt like a piece of junk was interesting. We saw some behavior change. I put that in quotes. You can't measure behavior change in a month, but you saw the precursor, especially the people in Pittsburgh were starting to be a little greener. But the part that was really interesting, which to me is more interesting than the app itself, because I think the app's a bad idea. Helping people who already want to be green be greener isn't really going to save the world. You need to get at everyone else. What was interesting about it is in our interviews with people after this, a lot of people would say things like, I rode my bike today because I wanted to get to the next level of the game. Or at work, people would ask me, what's going on with your polar bear? Or, I walked home because I wanted to get to the next part of the story. And they use these words story, and they use these words game, and we thought, we didn't design a story or game. What are they talking about? People will see story. We're wired to see stories. And so really, to me, the key result out of this study was, how do we use story to drive longer-term engagement in any of these types of applications? And we know this is a problem. So with these fitness applications, we know a third of the people abandon their Fitbit after only 3 months, 50% after 6 months. How are you going to cause people to want to keep doing these things and get into real habits that are going to change their lives? So I've been working with some psychologists here at Stanford on thinking about how we do this to change people's mindsets towards health. Now, one thing that originally came out of that observation was a project I started in China, but we're working on here at Stanford called Huazuki. And what we do with Huazuki is try to design a story from the beginning. So we have this character, Zuki. This is a sketch from one of the students showing that Zuki's going to go through all of these different travels and challenges along this adventure. And the idea is that every week, if you meet your goals, you'll get to the next chapter in the story. So, one chapter might be Zuki flying across in a balloon, and during the week, you'll see your progress, let's say this flag changing or the number of other balloons appearing to show you how much you've done. And if you reach your goal for that week, you'll get to the next chapter. Like in this chapter, Zuki's diving. Now, there's some backstory to the whole Zuki story that we're also studying, which is, it's called Huazuki because you see this purple character and you're like, what's that? Is that a bird? Is it an alien? You don't know. And the idea is there's this mystery that you learn as you go through the story. And in fact, Zuki's this character from another planet whose planet's been, overrun by runaway global warming, and Zuki's here on Earth, like collecting species and things to regreen his planet. But you don't learn this till you're going through the story. So this is what the user interface looks like that we designed for Android, and some students have been building this. But the idea is to have this as a research platform where we can test a variety of these research ideas. So for example, does having multiple scenes to this story really lead to longer term engagement than if we just had, let's say, one scene that repeated every week like we had in UbiFit? So this allows us to test it. Another one is we could make this purely about physical activity, so like a Fitbit application, but what we want to do is mix sustainability together with activity. And what we want to know is, can we use activity and fitness as kind of a way to get into people also to do some sustainability? So we would like to test it to say if we mix physical activity and sustainability versus a version that's just sustainability, do we get people to do more green activity in the case where we mix them? That's a research question we have. We're also interested in the cultural impact. So I told you we did a study between China and the US. When I first arrived to China, I went to a research talk from a professor from Japan, and he was talking about some feedback systems for physical activity that looked really familiar. They looked very similar to some papers I had published, and I was really curious, going, where did they get this stuff? And he said, yeah, there's these people in Seattle at Intel, they've done a lot of this work. And he said, but they don't understand Asian culture. He said, all of their feedback is positive. He said, we need negative feedback. And I asked, do you have evidence of that? And he said, no, but everyone knows it. Which to me said, oh, this is a really interesting research question. So we did do a study where we gave feedback on a carbon calculator, so standard Lawrence Berkeley Lab carbon calculator. We did it for several hundred Chinese and US participants where we manipulated either positive or negative feedback and had people pledge to make changes and then self-report what changes they had made to their home energy pattern. And what do you know? The negative feedback for the Chinese participants had a statistically significant larger impact on their self-reported behavior change, and for the Americans it was the opposite. Now, some flaws with that study is it's self-reported, we don't have a baseline measure, so we don't really know, but it gives us some more indication that is true. So I have a student who's Chinese who wants to work on manipulating the feedback in this to see if we see that kind of behavior occurring. The last area of kind of an important challenge that I wanted to share with you was in education. So the one thing that I found while living in China was the educational system is producing a lot of college graduates. The education system in China does very well on international exams. So when I was living in China, middle school students near Shanghai scored top in the world on this exam called the PISA. And I remember I was coming back to the US for a trip, and it was there was a lot of controversy. I think the Chinese president was having a visit to the US. And it had a lot of people in the US really questioning, what's going on with our education system. The Chinese beat us in this. And in fact, the Chinese did better than the US students on English on this exam even. Okay, so it wasn't just science and math. Now, it was a little cooked in that those students were from some select schools, whereas the US was much more of a regular sample. But still, it was interesting. But what was more interesting to me was the reaction in China. So although a lot of people were very happy, like, yeah, we're number one, we're doing well. I read a lot of blogs and things where people were worried that, oh yeah, we did well on this exam, but our system leads to too much conformity and efficiency. So in other words, we've become a factory for the world, but we're also having kind of a factory educational system, and it's not leading to innovation. So this idea of innovation and creativity is a big concern in China because they don't want to be producing your iPhone, they want to be designing your iPhone. That's where the money is, a lot more money. So that's a concern that we've seen in China. In the US, we see the opposite concern. You rarely hear people say, oh, are our kids creative? You hear, can they do the basics? So, in some ways, in China, they're way more on the fundamentals and they want to move towards more of the creativity. In the US, we're more on the creativity and want to move more towards the fundamentals. The most interesting example of this was at this time, this book came out, the book by the Tiger Mom, right? How to Raise Your Kids. And in the US, the reaction to that book is, that book's really about how to make our kids, train them more like Chinese kids or Chinese American kids. The same book in China, the cover has her with an American flag behind her of the US map, and essentially it's, how do we make our kids train them more like a Chinese American mom, right? And she was considered tame. In China, there was the wolf dad who, his 4 kids had all gone to Peking University, and if they didn't get an A, they got beat, and so she was considered like a kinder, gentler mother. So it was interesting that both societies kind of were in extreme looking the other way. So an interest I've had is, where might we use technology to kind of find this balance between creativity and fundamentals? I've liked this quote that is attributed to Da Vinci, though we think he may never have said it, but I still like it. And he said, I've been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do. To me, that is about the balance of both knowing the fundamentals, but also applying, doing, creating things is how you really learn. And so I've been interested, where could we, use technology to do something like this? And in 2010, when the iPad came out, it really reminded me of something I had read back when I was in graduate school in 1995, which was this book by Neal Stephenson called The Diamond Age. Has anyone here ever read The Diamond Age at all? Okay, so Neal Stephenson is a well-known sci-fi author. I'm not a big sci-fi person, but this book from a technology perspective, I thought was really groundbreaking. The Diamond Age referred to this age in the future of nanotechnology where we could essentially make anything out of diamond because it was a really good material. But the really interesting part of this novel is the subtitle, which is not actually correct over there. It's actually or, comma, a young lady's illustrated primer, where primer refers to a British school book. And the idea was this was this smart book. It was like, think of your iPad today. But it was a novel that the student who owned it, who possessed it, actually becomes a character in the story she's reading. And this novel is very context aware. It knows what she knows, it knows what's going on in her family, it knows where she is right now, and it adapts to that. And she has to learn things in the real world for the story to move forward. And so think of it as a smart personal tutor that uses story as the way of engaging the student. So when I read this in graduate school, I was at Carnegie Mellon, we had some of the best AI people in the world, and we all thought, this is what we would call AI complete. You could never build this. It was impossible. But after the iPad came out, so 15 years after I first read that, I started to think about it and thought, oh, you could build this today. Some of the AI problems that I thought were really hard, there's ways around them. Like, for example, some things that really need human intelligence, you could use crowdsourcing as a way to give students feedback, et cetera. The hard part actually is more of the story. How do I make a story that's so engaging that a student would read it for months or years? In this story, the girl has this book from age 5 to 18, right? That seems impossible that I can make a story you would not put down for that many years. But could I even do it for a year or 2 years? That's the hard part. And so what are the kind of activities? So you might have activities where kids are learning about measurement, whether it's pushing these little fake frogs across the floor and measuring, or measuring water or trees, or they're building a solar oven and doing calculations on how much that affects the temperature of water or something else. So this is something I started at Stanford just about a year ago. And what I did, which I thought I would never do as a computer science professor, is I had a book club where I felt very much like the social sciences here. I had 6 Stanford undergrads who were interested in this, and we just read this novel together. So once a week we'd come together and we would discuss what we had read. And we were trying to deconstruct what was the technology described in this novel and which pieces of it would be important for education today and which just make it a fun book to read. For example, in the book, this bad boyfriend of the girl's mom throws the book across the room at the girl's head, and what do you know, this thing just kind of figures it out and floats down. We're not going to build that. But which things are important is what we were concerned with. So the next thing we did was last summer is we tried to make a video that told a bit of the story of what we thought this could look like. This doesn't really capture everything in terms of what the student would see, but this tried to give a flavor for what we were trying to do. And we're still, I'd say, in the design stages of this, let alone building much. But this will just give you a flavor of what we were trying. So here's how we kind of characterize the old style of school, copy down what the teacher's doing. Not much of that now in the US, though in China, actually, there So this doesn't really show what the story might look like. What we were looking at is what are the kind of activities that someone might do. And the next thing we looked at is how would you take those activities and get them in a story so that they would feel natural and someone would do it. So you might, those of you who have seen Pokemon Go, think of this almost like Pokemon Go for education, though we were doing this before Pokemon Go came out. But we were looking at things just like that. For example, could you use all of the geocaching caches that are around the world as a way of making it personal to a certain student? They could go find this thing near them that seems like a mystery that then unlocks something else in the story and moves it forward. So this is the earliest kind of work that I'm doing at this moment that I wanted to show you. The last thing I wanted to show you before I take questions is where do I see this going in terms of research collaboration as well as educational collaboration. So when I was in China, again, I felt it was really important that many of these problems that we're working on are really shared across the world. And in fact, some of them very tightly with China. You're not going to make any impact on global warming unless you get the US and China to make impact. In fact, China over the next, I think 10 or 20 years will build more square footage than exists in the US today. Imagine just knocking it all down and building it. The way you build that, the way you design those cities, the way people use technologies in those cities will affect the future of the planet. So what might we do there? So I was interested in starting a joint kind of research and educational institution with colleagues in China that would really be this place to work on these kind of problems where you could take risks and really invent the future while tackling the important problems. And it had this combination of design and technology. So I've started this in at least a small scale with colleagues at Tsinghua in Beijing, which is really like many people consider the MIT of China, though it's kind of a little richer in MIT in that besides being really great in computer science, they have one of the best design schools in China, one of the top 3, the Academy of Art and Design. So I have great colleagues there. Now what's interesting, I started this before I was at Stanford, but at Stanford, we have this great facility at Peking University, which is literally across the street from Tsinghua, and that's more like the Harvard of China. And there's this beautiful Stanford building there. It looks kind of small from the surface, but it's got 3 floors underground. It's a beautiful facility. And it becomes a great place to kind of run some of this collaboration. So one of the first things that I've tried here is doing exchanges. I ran something called the World Lab Summer Institute. First I did it in 2012 when I was still at UW, where we had 12 Tsinghua students come to the US, put them together with 10 US students. They worked together for 7 weeks. This summer, I had the really great experience of returning to China, and I took 6 Stanford students with me, along with 1 high school student from Princeton, New Jersey. And we worked together with 8 Beijing students, 2 from Beida, 6 from Tsinghua. And for 4 weeks, we did lectures and projects and obviously tours in China. And I just want to give you a little flavor of what they do. For those 4 weeks. For those 4 weeks. So in those 4 weeks, we put the students through what we would cover in 10 weeks here at Stanford, and the course I teach here in the fall. But they went through all of this and also getting to visit some of the top research labs like Baidu and Microsoft Research. And they all worked on themes related to what I just talked about. So we had people working in health, we had people working in education, we had people working in environment. And in 4 weeks, they went from going out in the field and doing need finding to doing lo-fi paper prototyping to then building a prototype and then finally a video that represented what they did. In this one case, this one team, I'm going to show you a video just to give you a flavor of it. They wanted to work on early childhood development. How do you help parents know more about the developmental milestones and give them feedback about it, but also being something that people would want to use. So I'm just going to show you, this is just an example of the 4 teams all created videos on par with something like this. That's the Stanford facility too, which is really great. You'll notice a lot of Stanford art in the back. So I forgot to mention that I taught this class with Professor Ge Wang, who's here in the Department of Music at Stanford, who's a really creative researcher as well as teacher. And that combination of somebody coming more from the technology side with somebody coming more from the arts, I think really made a special experience for the Stanford students who did this. The bigger experience, I think, more than what they learned from our lectures and doing these projects, was the cultural experience. All of the teams were half Chinese students, half Stanford students, and those teams really bonded over those 4 weeks, and I think they're gonna have lifelong friends. And that experience, you know, I somehow hate to admit thinking you want your lecture and these other things to be, but I think that experience is really what they took the most from this. So if you're interested in that, at this webpage, you can see all the materials and all the videos from all the teams and everything they did. But I think this facility that Stanford's put there really needs more support from the alumni or from donors to keep it running. I think it's actually underutilized, and I would love to find a way to do more things there. So in conclusion, I think many of these problems that I've tried to show you are not problems that any one researcher or any one university is going to solve, but I think it's important to get the research community around focusing on problems that impact the world instead of, you know, what's the latest social mobile app that I can make. In fact, in the teaching, I think it's hard. You'll see in our classes, the students get really focused on doing kind of the next incremental thing, and being able to teach courses like this where you kind of force people to try to do something that's going to impact the world, I think is valuable in their education. So I encourage your feedback and any help you might have in helping create this World Lab and make it something that can be more impactful for students here at Stanford in the future. So thank you for your time, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah.
So I noticed a lot of your examples were focused on consumer behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, I'm a policymaker in DC.
Right.
I was wondering if you've given thought to how the lessons learned about storytelling and gamification and like even the displays of progress, how that could be applied besides just at the individual consumer level,
Right.
but I'm personally interested in the policy level,
Right.
or at a corporate behavior
Yeah.
level.
So the question is, most of these are consumer-oriented solutions. What might be useful for policymakers or people looking at companies at a more aggregate level? I've thought about it. It's not been my research focus, but I do believe policy is as important or more important even in some of these questions. For example, if I were able to, put a gas tax on, right? That could have much more impact than me showing people to be greener in their driving behavior. It's not where my research knowledge is, so I haven't gone there, even though I'm aware of it. Other people have done things, for example, making visualization tools that city planners could use to kind of make arguments for where you're going to place new light rail stations or things like this. So one of my colleagues at UW there, Alan Borning, who did his PhD here at Stanford, had a great system. It was like SimCity for city planners, right? And that is the kind of tool you would do. The other area really is visualization and information visualization. Here at Stanford, we're lucky to have Manish Agrawal, who's a MacArthur winner, who's one of the world experts in information visualization. And so those kind of tools applied to these problems are the kind of tools that would allow policymakers to see things they might not see when they're just looking at a 100-page report of data. So how do you visualize the data? I haven't done that work, but I think that's where the angle I would take it if I were to do that. Yeah.
You mentioned collaborating with a professor of medicine and also with psychology.
Yeah.
What opportunities have you provided for engagement with the arts in computer science classes?
So in the arts, we have I feel like a broken record here. Camille Uderbach, who's another MacArthur Award winner, she joined Stanford just 3 years ago, and she's been teaching some cross-listed courses with CS. I can't remember the title, but something like drawing with code. And so we've had students moving between those classes who are either art or computer science. I have an undergraduate who's published now 3 papers with me. We're working on something I hadn't shown here at all. I do some work on human-drone interaction. So how do you interact with drones in the future, projecting with projectors from the drone and tracking you with a Kinect camera. And this one student, he's an art major, and he's doing research in computer science. So the one pleasure for me that I've seen here in my time at Stanford, I've been on the faculty at Berkeley, I've been on the faculty at Washington, and I was on the faculty for 1 year at Cornell's new campus in Manhattan. The one difference is the students are so broad that they could do anything. And so you'll have students who, oh yeah, I was an architecture major and now I'm doing computer science or whatnot. And that's really been the pleasure. The students can move very easily between these areas because they tend to be real generalists as well as being deep. So I haven't provided specific activities other than we have students who move between those. I would say there's bigger connections between design that often at Stanford happens in the D school, which is out of mechanical engineering. But we do have students who move across these, but I don't know if there's too many specific, specialized opportunities for it.
So the students can move, but is there a system that there is curricular support from the administration?
I don't-
Universities
yeah.
have a problem that there's not funding for interdisciplinary classes.
Yeah. So Stanford's tried, for example, this new program CS plus X, where they allow students to major in an area in the arts, for example, music in CS or art in CS. It hasn't succeeded in that the requirements are onerous, and so the students don't do it because it's pretty much doing a double major, and most people don't do that. So I'd actually say there isn't enough of that. I think the university would like to move more towards that. I haven't seen enough of that to occur. And I think the university wants it because there's too many students in CS. Right now, CS has 20% of the undergraduates at Stanford, which is just not sustainable. It makes my class that used to be 40 people when I taught it at Berkeley. Here I taught it to 225 last year. So that balance is something the administration I know is working on. But I think you're right. More opportunities for that would be helpful. I haven't seen it. Now, I've only been at Stanford for 2 years, so haven't learned everything going on, but I haven't seen anything that pops out to me. There was a question back there. Oh, yeah.
Have you done any studies that focus on the effects of community on Fitbit adoption, for example? You mentioned a statistic earlier.
Yeah.
There's a lot of drop-off. I'm one of, I guess, the minority that is
Yeah.
using it, and it's because of the community.
Yeah. So I actually had about 10 designers from Fitbit in my office this summer, and they said something about community important for them. And I saw an article recently with the founder of Fitbit saying they're kind of moving the business kind of more to being this community thing. So I think that, if done well, can work. The problem is I've found different people have different values that drive them. So, for example, you might be driven by the community. He might want to, save money. I might want to save the whales. Whatever that value is, I think what's important is to figure out that value of the user and then drive the interface that somehow motivates you based on that. So we did a study before the UbiFit system called Houston, where we had groups of women who knew each other working in kind of a community where they'd share their step counts on their phones and share their performance. And we actually found that if you didn't do community right, it could actually lead to worse performance. So for example, this was all step counts. So they were walking. One woman saw her friend walking. She pulled over in her car. She said, "What are you doing? You're walking up this big hill. You don't get credit for that." Right? Right? So she goes, "I know a really great flat walk." Right? So, in some ways, if it's not done right, it could discourage it. So social can be really important in this problem, and I think Fitbit and others have found some success, but it's actually a harder design problem, I think, than people think to do it well for everyone. Yeah.
The question is, do you know of Dr. Bree Lincoln Hooker? There was a session that she did yesterday on how you bring in size. I thought it was very interesting. We talked about positive reinforcement.
Yeah.
Negative reinforcement.
Yeah.
She gave the example, for example, that blood drives, right? If you actually incentive people based on money, there were less people that would go.
Right.
Whereas if you handed out T-shirts,
Yeah.
there were more people that would
Right.
go.
Who was that?
Dr. Bree Lincoln Hooker.
Okay, I don't know her, but I'll look that up. Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the issues that I want to work on that I haven't done yet is even in that kind of study, we'll find some general result that, hey, T-shirts work better than some other incentive. But the fact is, there's probably subgroups within that, T-shirts are better on average, and maybe he's really a T-shirt guy, but yeah, I can tell. But for him, it's something totally different. And so one of the ideas I have is, how do we figure out what those values are? We can do it either automatically through data mining or more explicitly through a survey, and then have the interfaces adapt to the thing that would cause the most change for you. And I think that's a place, most apps and other things, we just make one thing and just hope everyone will use it. But instead, if we can make them adapt to different values, I think we can do better.
I hate to stop us with this really engaging thing. You guys have a very full day ahead of you. I want to thank Professor Landay for spending an hour.